Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here to review two different films. At the end of the day, I'm going to be re-reviewing both of these films because I rather enjoy them. The only thing is, I'm going to have to try to review them in a much more cleaner variation to leave out some kind of very much more bedroom-like business or adult content-ish like things to ultimately lead out that kind of stuff told me these videos won't get red flagged for anything, because ultimately I want to very much try to actually have a channel I can legitimately monetize at some point, which would be great. If you guys like any of these reviews and you want to let everybody know that I go through and do all this kind of stuff, let everybody know. Definitely try to get this channel up to monetizable gains, which ultimately is 1,000 subscriptions and this and that. But ultimately, hey, everything helps. Every little bit helps. So at the end of the day, let's go into talking about these movies. So, It Follows. Where could you say at the end of the day you could say you could see this movie? Ultimately, I would very much more at first recommend people go into a bootleggish like app, probably like a Movie Pro or otherwise a justifiably movie app thing. Movie boxes kind of work. There's a Movie Box Plus that ultimately I think works really good to try to get a number of kind of other kinds of sites and otherwise movies and this and that. So, because It Follows is actually on Hulu, but when you go into it, it ultimately mentions that it is on the Sci-Fi like network. So maybe if you go into the Sci-Fi app, you can probably maybe see ultimately where that leads you. But more than likely, those are usually with some kind of like token-esh like thing where you can only see a certain number of stuff on the Sci-Fi app service, or there's sometimes where there's a network thing that ultimately is asking for that. So more than likely, I'm just telling you to do that at first, because it'd just be way easier to just do a Movie Pro or ultimately go into a movie box, roll the dice, and ultimately see if you can watch It Follows. Deadly Virtue, easier enough. A little bit easier. Deadly Virtues, ultimately you can see this app on a 2B device, like app. If ultimately you can have an app called 2B, TUBI, you can ultimately see Deadly Virtues, which is justifiably such a good film that ultimately I was like, you know what, no. I want to re-review this movie, talk about it, because I actually like it. I don't care that either one of these movies at the end of the day no one will even know exist, but you know what? F it. Like, I liked these movies, and so I rewatched them, and so now I'm going to talk about them here today on this video. So, let's go, of course, and talk about these movies as if people don't know what they are, because by and large, maybe a lot of people don't. It Follows. Ultimately, if you go into the podcast called Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, ultimately, it seems most of the time, whenever Michael Rosenbaum brings up that he's doing some kind of horror podcast, ultimately, he mentions that he thinks that the best horror movie to him was It Follows. Ultimately, I had seen It Follows well beyond that, and ultimately, when Michael Rosenbaum would talk about this movie, I'm like, heck yeah! Like, I enjoyed this movie. I thought that this movie was interesting. I thought that this movie was a cautionary tale, and ultimately to tell you that ultimately, maybe you shouldn't let everybody into your bedroom, or maybe in some cases, the back seat of a car, if you know what I mean. Basically, it's kind of telling people that, yeah, some decisions that people make could really legitimately cost them, and cost them to the point of them having to wonder for the rest of their lives, justifiably, if they are going to die. every single second of their day. Hey, am I going to die right now? Because I'm seeing a person that makes no sense for me to see them. And ultimately now, I'm kind of questioning some things. I'm questioning some stuff. And so yeah, I kind of want to vaguely talk about this movie at first because ultimately there might be some stuff that I mentioned in this movie that could quite possibly tick some people off. That if I were to mention something, it might give some stuff away in the movie. And if you've never seen it, you'll eventually go into this movie and be like, oh man, he ruined this for me. Oh, now I knew when this person says this that it's like, it's prominent. There's a prominent reason for this going on, these words to be said at some point in this movie. So, going into this film, it follows. I watched this movie for yet a second time. I didn't think I needed to have multiple viewings and watchings of this movie because I think it honestly would have really and truly ruined it. And I think even the second time around, I think it kind of did like. I feel like this movie needs to really be a one off film. I don't think that it can very much be like, I need to watch this multiple times, but a lot of people would feel differently, or a lot of people would ultimately just like, nope, I've seen this 20, 100 bazillion times. And ultimately, I know the words of this movie by heart. Because ultimately, this might be a kind of a coming of age movie for a lot of people. And so, reasonably, maybe they enjoy this movie because it feels like a movie that is like a coming of age like thing for them, or at the end, this is a fairly odd film at some points within this movie. So, let's go into me talking more about this movie in very vague like detail. So, within this movie, we have a main character called Jay that it seems at a lot of points, it seems like in the very beginning of this, there's a whole lot of innocence going on. It's just kind of people enjoying their youth, ultimately thinking about the kind of next things going on in their school and their lives and their this and that. And ultimately, there's some guy that comes in new in town and ultimately meets some girl, and this girl's like, yeah, I think he might be the one, but then he ends up really being the one in a severely wrong way. A very wrong way, because ultimately, weirdly enough, this guy needs to have this woman survive, otherwise he is also very much in trouble as well. And I will have to explain that in spoiler variations because there's a whole rule system to this thing following a person never endingly. And I guess it's lucky that this girl ended up getting these rules from this guy, but realistically, she kind of had to backpedal and to get the rules, to get the real set of rules. So, and I don't know how people came up with these rules eventually at some point, but I guess that's just what happens. So, anyways, going on to this movie, I really did enjoy it. I really love the desperation of this movie. I like the planning that they have to kind of try to figure out if there's any way to really uh, take out this thing that is following this girl. And ultimately, there are desperation moves to ultimately get her to think that there is going to be some person that is going to get rid of this to give it to someone else. So going into this, yeah, it's really interesting. It's a really I thought it was a really fun movie, and ultimately there's quite a bit of points where there are jump scares within this movie. There's moments of which you're unexpecting some things, and then there's also some other times where we're like, oh, okay, so that's what ends up happening when when someone ends up um, getting tagged. Let's just say, if you, especially if you know what this movie, you know what I mean. When eventually It Follows ends up really getting up close and personal to one person. So let's go into the spoiler because I've already been talking for 10 minutes about this movie. Let's go into spoilers about this movie. Let's break it down and ultimately really go into this film. At the end of the day, let's go out our way to spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, spoilers. So, Kay ultimately meets a guy named Hugh. So, we have Kay meets Hugh. Ultimately, they go to a movie theater somewhere, and while they're waiting in line to ultimately see this movie, they play they play the trading game. They ultimately go and look around into their environment and ultimately think of a person who they would want to be and trade and want to trade places with them. Ultimately, we have it to where uh, Hugh ends up going first, and ultimately Kay ends up getting it wrong. And so eventually, once we go into the movie theater, now it is actually Kay's turn to ultimately be looking around and this and that. And so we ultimately have it to where Hugh ultimately has to pick out some girl in a yellow dress. And so ultimately he's like, oh yeah, the girl in the yellow dress. And ultimately Jay is just like, what girl in the yellow dress? I didn't see any girl in the yellow dress. And so ultimately, like, Hugh basically just drops in and is like, you know what, how about we just enjoy the movie? Like, come on. So it's like he's kind of quickly getting tired of the game. So eventually they see this movie, and that eventually leads to, I guess, them really cementing them being a real, true, really seemingly good relationship, even though it really seems like Kay doesn't know much about Hugh. So ultimately leading to seemingly Kay wanting to desperately probably pop off her cherry and have her first time into a backseat like car. And so reasonably it ends up first time, and so then right after that, it seems like after they are kind of in the car just kind of like talking about things, it ends up that Hugh ends up putting chloroform into Kay's mouth. And then Kay wakes up tied to a chair, ultimately to have Hugh explain things to her. Ultimately telling her that, hey, yeah, I had to infect you with this thing. This thing is going to follow you everywhere you go. Realize that like I desperately had to do this, but I'm going to let you know the best way, the best chance for you to be able to beat this by telling you the rules, telling you how to beat this, tell you how to figure this out. So this guy is tying this woman up, telling her what's going on, and then showcasing one of these things to her to help her, like, tell her that this is real. This is a real thing. So basically, she ends up getting, like, told about this, and then so eventually she ends up getting dumped off on the side of the road, and then you just have, like, Hugh just peeling out. Ultimately, for the cops to be called, eventually, they're, like, her I think her sister and her friend end up finding her, and then trying to like comfort her as try to comfort her and this and that. So she files a report, ultimately seemingly not knowing much about Hugh himself, because reasonably we find out that Hugh had kind of gone like from another town to find this woman and hope that she ends up like knowing all the rules and doing this all right. Otherwise, Hugh, tag you're it again, because that's how this works. So basically Hugh desperately told her like that she has to find someone else to sleep with and ultimately tell them the rules. Tell them like how to beat this thing, and the more that people know about this, the easier it will be. So reasonably we have it to where Kay is kind of going, and she at first is very much trying to go through a normal day, like just like ultimately thinking that none of which that Hugh had said had any rational and or nonsense. So Kay ultimately just starts going through her normal day, but then all of a sudden, while she is starting to go from places here and there via school, like she is starting to notice that like there's seems to be a person that kind of stands out in the crowd. So here's the thing. So reasonably, when Hugh had called out that girl in the yellow dress that ultimately Kay did not see, there's a reason for that, because ultimately that person actually wasn't there. That person was only there for Hugh. So we have it to where this girl is going through her day of school, and it seems like this thing is consistently following her around, and to the point to where eventually this girl just freaks out, and while she's at school, because this thing is consistently following her, even to the point of following her in class. And so she eventually just has to forcibly leave school. She forcibly just like she can't do a normal day of school. So she ends up leaving to forcibly have to go on a vacation. She goes on a vacation to ultimately try to figure out how to like find Hugh again, but then ultimately to have seemingly one of her friends try to sleep with her, so ultimately she can get away with this. Ultimately we have Kay with her sister, and ultimately we find out that ultimately Paul is with them, and Paul ultimately had some ties with Kay's sister, but recently it seemed more and more that Paul really wanted to be with Kay, or be with Jay, not Kay. So I'm getting the K's and J's mixed up. So yeah, the main character girl. So you ultimately have Jay this time around, not Kay. So Jay ultimately is trying to very much still like take this vacation and try to like have a normal day, but everything completely keeps going horribly awry. Reasonably to the point to where ultimately Kay is at some uh, friend's home, and reasonably the entire time she is consistently presented with these followers that only she can see. So reasonably it gets to the point to where ultimately like this girl isn't really able to sleep, she's thinking at any point she's going to fall asleep and a follower is going to be right in front of her and she didn't even know. So recently she's having trouble sleeping. Paul is just trying to comfort her with some kind of like their past or their backstory. So it gets to the point to where like Jay is kind of freaking out for every little sound, and ultimately we find out that it's just kind of um, Kelly's sister just ultimately saying hey, can I kind of like be with you guys tonight and this and that. So eventually, when they open a door, there is a follower right behind Kelly trying to make its way into this door, and so they end up trying as quickly as possible to make out of this home, knowing full well it seems that there is nowhere to go. So it ends up forcibly that Kay ends up getting hurt and has to be sent to the hospital at some point in this movie. Because really, what ends up happening is that they end up getting hurt, and because they have to kind of run away from this thing. Eventually, they get to the point of catching up with Hugh, and he is a completely different person than what he said he was. Like his whole entire life is a lie and or sham. But and when ultimately Kay ultimately catches up with Hugh, ultimately he is telling her the real and brutal truth. It's like, well, hey, like I needed to desperately find some other person that I didn't know in this town to give to you to ultimately tell you the rules. And ultimately he keeps telling her that it's like, dude, all you need to do is sleep with another person and you will be completely fine. So basically have that person deal with this, ultimately tell them the rules, and ultimately just keep spreading this thing around to person to person to person, or figure out some way of just getting it to where this thing is no longer a factor, or this and that and what have you. Just either end yourself, or but I think even if she were to end herself, it would go right back to Hugh, and so ultimately he would be it again. So ultimately he needs to figure out a way to spread this thing no matter what. So ultimately, yeah, Hugh is telling her it's like, dude, you need to just be with somebody, and like that is it. That's all you can do. There's no way to outsmart this to where ultimately it'll never not come for you. There's no way to beat it. Like, believe me, like, it's not going to work. But these people try things anyways. They try to take this thing down, and it's interesting to watch because ultimately, when they are at the beach, ultimately they are really and truly confronted with one of these things at the beach. And because what ends up happening is that Kay, while in the hospital, gives it to um, one of her friends, and so ultimately we have it to where he tries to pass it on to somebody, but it doesn't really seem like it's really all that working all that well. It doesn't really seem like all his game isn't all like really going into him being able to get a girl he barely knows to sleep with him and this and that. So it's really it's really difficult. And ultimately, Kay is asking this friend. It's like, well, hey, I want to update. Like, how is this going? Because I want to know. Because ultimately, if you sleep with another person, I'm in the clear completely. And he's like, well, yeah, this isn't really all seeming exactly like that easy, you know. Like it could be easier for females, but for guys, it's not that easy. So, and ultimately, that's kind of what Hughes says. Ultimately, he also mentions that at some point, a follower could take the form of any family member or anything like that. Um, but again, this family member will only be seen by the really and truly infected person. And or just really whoever is ultimately had, I think, had been infected, because reasonably, like, I think Jay still like has some resemblance of seeing the followers at some point, because I think she is kind of like on, like, she's kind of on deck, like ultimately, like the thing is still going after her, but she can still see things, I think. To where Hugh ultimately, like, he is completely just like, yeah, I think I'm okay. So it ends up that her friend ends up just realistically opening his door to who he thinks is just his mom, because again, he doesn't really truly quite understand exactly how like a follower works. So ultimately, we have it to where her friend opens a door to who he thinks is his mother, and it is his mother, but his mother is jumping on him and just, let's just say, aggressively uh, aggressively uh, s- sucking the essence out of him, let's just say. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what these things do. Is ultimately when you finally do get tagged by this follower, you basically are just like, yeah, you're done, son. You're dead. You're like, this thing is going to suck the life out of you and kill you now. So, ultimately, now, Kay is now it, and ultimately, she is on beach, just going like, God, there's no way to get rid of this. There's no way to like. Ultimately, this girl is looking at like being on the water, and Paul's like, "Hey, how about you come in?" And really, Jay is like, "Yeah, how about no?" So, because ultimately she doesn't want to be stuck in a location, and then all of a sudden the follower comes, and then she's effed. So eventually it gets to the point anyways where a follower just starts walking up onto her, and ultimately, like, Kay realizes this because this girl of course sticks out as well as a lot of the other ones. Ultimately they are just kind of walking just kind of like to her, and they all look very like out of place, or sometimes some of them don't even look fully fledgely clothed to the point to where they severely stick out. So you have it to where this girl is walking up to Kay, and ultimately she's realizing, oh my god, like at first she just thinks it's a normal person, but then she's like, oh no, it's one of them. So we have it to where Paul is trying to like is telling Kay, hey, point out where she is, because ultimately Kay had her hair grabbed by this follower, and so Paul ends up smacking this chair to where he thinks this follower is, and it just dents the chair and chucks him from a distance. You can't actually see this follower doing it, but that's what happens. So because ultimately, like, this follower has that kind of power, and but it's like like it's done from the perspective of the people that don't actually see anything, so it's kind of a very interestingly done kind of approach. Like, how is it that they dented the chair, but on top of that, how is it that they chucked that guy on top of that as well? So basically they end up having to, like, Jay is firing a gun at this thing, and like ultimately, I'm kind of probably a lot of this kind of getting things out of place. Because ultimately, I think this beach thing ends up coming up before the scene that I just mentioned, but it's kind of an interesting dynamic to see like how far this thing goes. So Jay ultimately fires like bullets into this thing, ultimately leading to where basically people get hurt in the process because bullets flying at an invisible object. it seems like a bullet gets caught by this thing, but ultimately gets right back up and keeps on chugging along, ultimately to take a form of a different person, but it's still a follower. So it just seems like this thing is never going to end. It seems like this thing is going to keep going on. So eventually, now we emerge to Kay being it again, kind of transitioning now back to that point. And so we have it to where it seems that they're trying to come up with a deductive reasoning of like, okay, maybe there is a way that we can actually defeat this thing that justifiably means we can take this thing down and have it to where this thing is just over. Because reasonably, like, they're just thinking that this follower is just one entity, and then if you just take it down, ooh, yeah, easy beatdown. No, not exactly. So what ends up happening is that Jay ends up getting into a pool. And so recently what their plan of attack is they decide to put electrical items within, like, right next to this pool, trying to say that ultimately, more than likely, the follower will probably get electrified, but Jay will actually be safe. Like, they're trying to think of some strategy where probably Jay could probably jump out of the pool and this and that, thinking that once this follower gets into the pool and Jay gets out, that they can come up with some kind of plan of attack that way. Um, but ultimately, like, the follower doesn't really actually seemingly get into the pool. So ultimately, Paul is consistently asking for Jay to point it out to him, and so yeah, it gets to the point where eventually one of the things of equipment eventually, like one of the electrical things, ends up falling into the pool, but doesn't electrocute Jay, luckily enough. So basically, they've desperately tried everything to just try to fight this thing, to the point of ultimately just having Paul just say, it's like, well, you know what? How would I take this from you? And then I just give it to someone else. So we go with the same, like, quarterback like plan, because ultimately Paul was just kind of, he was kind of a little ticked off that this girl didn't come to him, that ultimately he went through other means, because ultimately, like, Paul was kind of thinking that maybe eventually Jay was eventually going to see Paul as eventually being her lover or whatever, but it always seems like she thrusts herself into the arms of another man. So Paul ends up very much frustrated and just going, hey, like, give it to me and I'll give it to someone else. So we end up having where this movie just kind of tapers off, because I've kind of quickly reviewed a bulk of this movie, because basically a lot of it is just like the bedroom situations, and like there's some kind of school moments that I really just don't really quite care about. A lot about this movie can be quickly reviewed, so I thought it's better to do it that way. And so yeah. So ultimately we have it to where Jay and Paul have it out in seemingly a couch somewhere, and so now Paul has it. Paul is looking around. He's looking at girls like street ladies, if you want to say it that way, to ultimately pass this on to. He was ultimately like thinking about making an offer to a woman on the street, uh, thinking that maybe ultimately he'll be able to get rid of this fairly easy. So recently, that's where this movie kind of just tapers off, with Paul just kind of looking to try to get rid of this whole thing. I'm kind of interested to eventually have it be like, how is it that Paul like gets to like what does he do to actually tell these people all the rules after this thing goes on, and how is anybody going to be able to believe him? Doesn't make any sense to me, but I don't know. Probably that's probably why they didn't do a sequel of this movie, because probably no one would be able to buy a story like this, or otherwise it would be interesting enough to eventually see this thing eventually have a sequel. But I guess it would just be like, no, there's no way to sequelize this, because it would have to be too much of a close neck team to people to really trust someone. Like you have to have a whole movie built on trust, but then eventually you have to have somebody betray that trust at the beginning of this. And so yeah, it's just a really interesting movie. I really liked it, but at the end of the day, in a lot of ways, this is probably only meant to be a one sequel ish like film, and or one movie like film, not sequel ish like film, one movie like film. Because ultimately, it's just like, okay, where could you go with this? How could you build up sequels? That'd be weird. But yeah, more than likely have a bigger, grander scale or something like that of all this. I don't know. But yeah, at the end of the day, yeah, it follows. Fairly interesting. Go ahead and check it out. But moving on. Deadly Virtues. So, we we have a movie that at first feels like any movie that you've kind of ever seen on the surface. Reasonably, it just seems like a movie that is just like, oh, okay, well, some guy breaks into a couple's home and takes them hostage. Simple enough movie, but then all of a sudden you realize that there is something way more to this film than at first thought. It seems like there is a reason why Aaron picks these people. There is a reason behind all of this, and then eventually, once within this movie, it eventually gets revealed. And like it's very like this movie becomes very interesting, and like it's a very unique like tale to me, and then ultimately it's very interesting to see how like this movie ends, to just be like, oh my god, that's exactly how this person ends up getting to every single person's, oh my god, into everybody's like, oh my god, this is like, wow, okay, this makes sense. um Hopefully no one else sees this movie, because man, oh, uneasy for a lot of people. But anyways, yeah, this movie was a movie that I was just kind of like, I was gonna like fluff it off as it being just like, yeah, this is gonna just be like another, like this movie's gonna be kind of just a clunker. But then the more I went into it, I was like, you know what? Wow, this movie is actually really good, and it doesn't have to push. Like it has to push some things, but then also it doesn't have to go like it kind of maybe at some points like goes far, but like there could have been an absurd amount of escalation. But everything about Aaron's character has to have it be much more of a romanticizable element, and ultimately there is some story that we are not aware of until much more into this film. There's a whole entire story that we are completely that we are completely just left in the blip of, because the entire time we are rooting for Allison, and we were rooting for Tom, and we were like, how could this Aaron man do this? How could he do this? But then all of a sudden, once we get towards the end of this movie, we're like, oh my god, wow, this story just kind of blew my mind. And like, man, does it go to a very much more interesting aspect. And yeah, really solid movie that the more and more we really get to understand and be like, wow, like, and even rewatching this, it's a really good actual rewatch. Yeah, there's a big bomb at the end where ultimately it kind of like it might ruin the movie for a lot of people after like wanting to just go back and rewatch it. But like I waited a while and rewatched it and I'm like, no, still pretty good movie. Like still to me um like watching it again, knowing how exactly the movie ends, it was still a good watch to me. So Deadly Virtues. Let's go into spoilers about this movie because at the end of the day, there's probably in a lot of ways a lot of people that probably won't go out of their way to watch this. And with me cryptically talking about it, probably won't help very much. But I really enjoyed this movie. And ultimately, there are some adult like moments, but reasonably, it doesn't go too for some, uh, let's just say, uh, for the once it gets to the adult Ash like parts in this movie, it's kind of fairly tame compared to what this could also eventually had led to. Um, but reasonably, there is reasoning behind what everything Aaron is doing. There's reasoning behind everything. So let's go into spoiler time. Ultimately, I enjoyed this film. Hopefully, a lot of people will go out of their way to say that they saw it at some point. Maybe It Follows is still kind of trending because maybe still people enjoy that movie. So maybe it will lead them on to this movie as well. Just like, what the F is this film? Or more than likely, people will just like, yeah, this movie sucked. Because that's a lot of people. Where it's just kind of like, if it's not like one of those like mainstream Ash like movies, but a lot of people have different kind of flavors. Not saying that everyone like has to love an Avengers movie or an Avatar film, which I guess that would be mainstream, I guess. Knowing full well that anybody could watch any like different kind of movie that ultimately at the end of the day is like, oh wow, like I really liked this movie and no one has ever heard of it before is perfectly okay at the end of the day. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time at that point in time. Let's spoil this movie. So, Deadly Virtues. So within this movie, we have a man that is busting in on two people, let's just say, in their bed. So ultimately, they are both in their bed. Uh, let's just say uh, any inconvenient like position, and ultimately we have Aaron that walks in on Allison and Tom, and ultimately mentions, "Hey, uh, can I butt in? Can I take turns? Or can I be next?" And Tom ultimately is completely off guard about this, and ultimately he can't exactly just stop what he's doing. And so basically he ends up trying to pull away from his bed, and Aaron ends up smacking him across the side of the face. I think with some kind of club of some kind or some kind of like device of sorts to try to knock him out. First time doesn't work. Second time does. It ends up that Aaron has this seemingly thing with ropes, and that's where things are getting very interesting within this movie. So ultimately, we have Tom to be left knocked out cold, And so we have Allison, who is seemingly running out of the room, to where ultimately Aaron is to eventually grab her and then ultimately force her into the kitchen to ultimately get um, pretty much roped into the kitchen, let's just say. So ultimately, while Aaron is now fully well being able to tie up Tom, tie him up to the tub, and keep him there, ultimately, through a lot of this, we have Aaron consistently going to Tom, and while eventually awakening Tom, plenty of times he is there to torture Tom consistently, cut off fingers, very much humiliate Tom, peeing on Tom, and any number of barrage of other kind of things to consistently humiliate him. Reasonably after Aaron takes care of Tom, ultimately Aaron goes back to get Allison to ultimately take a shower with Allison while Tom is in this tub. So they're all taking a shower, all three of them together, with Tom watching, while basically Aaron and Allison are having this shower time together. Let's just say that gets very, very creative because again, Aaron's goal is to humiliate Tom right in front of him and to basically tell Tom that he's a dog, that he's a crappy person, and this and that. So ultimately, we have it to where Aaron seems to have Allison go a little bit more freer than Tom. But what ends up happening is that Aaron still ties Allison up for the most point, um, having it to where she's usually tied to a bed or something along those lines. But there's a lot of times within this movie to where after torturing Tom consistently, Aaron is trying very much to get Allison to fall in love with him. That is supposedly his main goal, and that's what he tells her. So, reasonably, Aaron has Allison seemingly putting on a facade to Aaron that, oh yeah, hey, I can learn how to be your lover, supposedly. And Aaron is really catching up on like, oh yeah, like you are playing. Like I get it. You're trying to play this so then eventually she can figure out how to escape. And at some point where it seems like things are working out, because what Aaron ends up doing is he ends up doing stuff to make Allison feel better, or like better about her situation, I guess. So Aaron ends up putting on or making Alice put on some leather esh like outfit that is very tight and very awkward, and he crazily takes photos of her, and ultimately she is very humiliated wearing this dress because ultimately she wouldn't even wear this for her husband, and so ultimately that is the reason why Aaron wants her to put it on. So ultimately, basically after um, he is doing photos of her, and ultimately like is basically like putting on a photo shoot for her, just saying like, just basically like trying to tell her, it's like, yeah, you're great, you're great looking, you're amazing, like, yeah, like, this is great. So basically like giving her like photoshops, but then realizing that Tom would do the same numerous times over, having several costumes for his wife to be in, and right in front of her he deletes all of Tom's photos of his wife. It's like, dude, like, he ultimately breaks down and mentions like, why does he have all these photos of you? You are right here. Why does he need all these photos? So he deletes all of them. So eventually we find out, because Aaron finds out, ultimately Aaron finds Tom's phone, ultimately realizing that Tom had been cheating on Allison and Allison doesn't know about it. And but Aaron won't tell her that. So what Aaron ends up doing is he ends up going to Tom and confronting him about this, and then breaking breaking a photo of seemingly of seemingly some photo, and taking a shard of glass from off of the photo to ultimately um, carve a gash into Tom. Because reasonably, like, bulk of the time, like every single time that uh, Allison is Allison is at first like desperately like trying to play along, but Aaron is kind of frustrated with that. It's like, no, you have to really be, you have to really feel things. And so ultimately, like, he is cutting off Tom's thumbs. He even cuts off his wedding finger and gives her the ring. And like, yeah, like, I'm gonna keep on going with this. I'm gonna keep on cutting off his fingers. So we eventually have it to where Allison on a much more seemingly convincing like act, and Aaron is just trying to make Allison's life much more comfortable. Bizarrely, like, he's making food for her. Um he's like taking pictures of them together. He is ultimately trying to uh to reasonably, when he is cooking something, Allison ends up grabbing a knife and putting it under her seat. She eventually ends up having to forcibly needing to get up somewhere, and she drops the knife, and he notices like, oh yeah, I must have accidentally dropped that. Oh, my apologies. Like, well, I guess I'll correct that. So, and she he corrects it by hurting Tom yet again, because ultimately, like, this girl is trying to escape. And what ends up happening is, at some point, Allison ends up getting a knife from somewhere, and eventually almost is trying to escape, knocking Aaron out at some point, and then eventually going up to Tom and trying to untie him. And Tom has his cell phone in the bathroom, so reasonably he's telling her to call 911. So we have it to where ultimately Allison has this knife, and has this opportunity to escape, and she doesn't go through with it. Aaron ends up confronting her in the bathroom, and ultimately Tom is screaming for her to stab him. Like, you have a knife, stab him, and she can't do it. And so then Aaron just takes the knife from her and ends up retying her back up. And then ultimately ends up torturing Tom in the process, because every single thing is like seemingly endless torture for Tom, like basically to the point to where like it's just nonstop him being like tortured and brutally hurt. Like, he never gets like seemingly 1 ounce of food I've ever seen, but ultimately he goes out of his way to cook for Allison. So we ultimately have it to where we have Allison that is bizarrely, I think, more and more just slowly but surely, like, Aaron is asking, like, Aaron is asking, or Allison is asking Aaron, like, what should she be wearing every day? Because it seems like she would always have to ask Tom, because reasonably, it probably seemed that Tom didn't like whatever she would wear. Ultimately, Aaron would just say, hey, whatever is comfortable, whatever you like, just put on whatever. And so ultimately, that kind of freed her up to just put on whatever. Ultimately, realizing that, like, asking if she would, if he would like her to put on a certain kind of lingerie that her herself had designed that ultimately Tom didn't even know about or didn't even care for her to wear because he didn't like it. So recently, the more and more we go along into this story, the more Aaron is trying as much as possible to very much ingrain into Allison that, like, hey, I'm not going to try to hurt you, I'm just going to try to love you, and hopefully you will feel the same way. And this is so odd. And so Allison is more and more like starting to put on makeup. She is like just starting to wear like really nice clothes for Aaron, and ultimately he's consistently cooking dinners for her, and like he's ultimately trying to like very much belittle whatever Tom had ever told her, or whatever Tom had uh, like done for her, and this and that. So we end up having it to where Allison is consistently going into to the to the bathroom at times to see what Aaron does to Tom at certain points, but reasonably a lot of times they are just left on their own devices, kind of leaving Tom to be just left to the lurch to eventually try and otherwise see if he could get to his phone or something. So eventually we end up finding out that reasonably Allison at some point ends up finding out that there is yet another um, yet another woman in line. So, because reasonably what ends up happening is that Aaron finally is just cementing that Allison really did truly love him. So he makes breakfast for her in bed and then ultimately leaves notes saying that he has left. Ultimately, Allison is very much looking around and she is very confused on what's going on. She's like, oh my god, like he finally left? Like, oh my god, like he was just like he was like nice, but a little tight on the noose, if you know what I mean. So ultimately, we have it to where Allison is untying Tom, and ultimately he is demanding for her to get him out of the tub and then to get him a band-aid. And she's like, well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to do you want me to get you out of the tub or get you back? What do you want? And he's like, just get me out of the tub. And so we have it to where ultimately Tom is frustrated that ultimately Allison has all this makeup on. It's like, why do you have makeup? Like, why did you wear makeup for him? And why are you dressed really nice? Why are you wearing all this stuff? And Allison is just like, well, like I had to pretend that I had to pretend for Aaron. I had to pretend for him that so that way I could keep us safe. I could keep you safe. And Tom is just like, well, yeah, but did you did you sleep with him? Were you with him? So ultimately, Tom keeps harping back onto that. It's like, yeah, I'm sure you slept with him. I'm sure you did. And because ultimately, Tom very much is so tortured and beaten down and just overall just this is a horrific time for him, and she's wearing makeup and has the finest dress on, and he's just like, what happened here? I want to know what happened. And so ultimately we have to where Allison is had the note for Aaron, and Tom read it and said, anything that happens, blame me. Anything that happens next, blame me. So ultimately, we have it to where Allison eventually is trying to figure out how to call for emergencies, and then eventually finds out that that Tom and another girl is a thing. So because what happens is that ultimately Allison is trying very much to take care of Tom, and then pulls up his shirt, and it says in big giant letters carved into his chest, cheater. So ultimately Allison is like, oh my god, this guy didn't really always treat me that great, and now I see on his chest the word cheater. There's gotta be something to this. So ultimately, knowing full well that eventually she comes to the fruition that ultimately he had been cheating on her, and we have it to where this woman seemingly ends up coming to their home on the day of them being rescued. As if, yeah, I haven't really seen him in days. What's going on? Hey, is everyone okay? What's going on? Because he didn't answer any of her texts. So recently, the girl is like, oh my god, he's cheating on me. He treated me like garbage. He beat me up several times just now, because there has been consistent times where he had hurt her a little bit, then apologized, then grabbed her again, hurt her again, apologized, and you could probably just see that there's a consistent pattern of this, to the point where, especially in the very beginning of this situation where they're both in the bed, you can kind of understand, okay, this girl has completely submitted to this guy, and this whole intermission thing of Aaron got her to finally realize, hey, I no longer need Tom anymore. I don't need him anymore. And now I'm going to leave him and dump him and have this girl pick up the pieces. So what ends up happening is that Allison ends up telling her friend to take care of Tom, and ultimately she can keep him. And so while her friend is taking care of Tom, Tom starts beating her up as well. And what happens is we find out that Tom is with this other girl, and of course, they are pregnant with child. Ultimately, this girl had done an ultrasound. So yeah, this basically, like, Tom has already like putting up franchises and basically like uh going with multiple other girls, and then also eventually I'm assuming he's just going to eventually leave Allison at some point eventually, because realizing that, yeah, like, Aaron came at the perfect time. So what ends up happening is that Aaron, like, gets to seeing his seemingly new girl, and ultimately he is like, she's trying to check him, she's trying to like take care of him, and ultimately he doesn't really quite like how she's taking care of him because he's had a really bad time. And so ultimately all this leading up to him being just forcibly like talked down to, and this and that, ultimately is just releasing out this demon inside of him to ultimately hurt this girl that is now, of our knowledge, pregnant. So Allison ends up going into the defense of this girl, and ending up stabbing Tom and killing him. And ultimately, she breaks it down as like, "Hey, we're gonna say that like that I ended up killing him. It was self defense. That is our story, right?" And it's like, okay, right. So ultimately, it ends up being that like Tom ends up, like, of course, getting killed, and so at the end of the day, Allison is gonna end up going her own way anyways. So we end up finding out how Aaron exactly is able to be a man that ends up getting into people's homes. So Aaron ends up um, very much ending up uh, being a key maker. So reasonably, what ends up happening is a lot of people entrust this guy with his key, or with their key, and so ultimately, we have it to where somebody goes into this keymaker shop and he says, "Well, hey, yeah, this is going to take probably a good, decent hour or so. Like, it's going to take a really long time. Hey, if you want to come back, we'll have the key for you." And so we have this woman that comes in and just drops off her key and is like, "Okay, sure, I'll wait." So I think what ends up happening is that every time Aaron gets to see a next woman, he ends up kind of like following her and really doing his research, and to the point of like an upper echelon like degree, to ultimately know exactly what's going on in her life, knowing that she's treated well, and and so that way otherwise he can deliver to her something that is going to like make her feel love for the first time in I don't know how long, and then to also make her feel strong enough to leave said relationship that isn't working out. So yeah, yeah, I kind of liked this story. It kind of is very much like female empowerment because there's a whole entire story that we don't know about. I really thought that this movie was really good, but at the end of the day, people could also think otherwise. But justifiably, I really like this movie. and like dropping that bomb at the end to where it's like, hey, don't trust anybody with your keys because ultimately they can make a copy of it and ultimately get into your house and break into it. So, yeah, at the end of the day, don't trust anybody with your keys, and then also just realistically, um, make sure that if you're not in a good relationship, that Aaron isn't going to be knocking at your door at any point in time. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.